This video will continue our review of main tissue types. So without a further delay, let's get into it and start with epithelial tissues. As I am sure that you remember, these often cover body surfaces or cavities, and typically they are a sheet of cells specialized for this role. There are two main forms, the actual covering or lining epithelia that you think of immediately when we talk about epithelial tissues. Good example of that would be the skin. But we also have another important role for epithelium, and for this special cells are needed. And this is the glands that secrete materials. And these are glandular epithelia. A really good example of this would be, I think, the salivary glands. And as you see here, epithelial tissues do much more than just line surfaces. Remember their protective role and role as a selective barrier, as well as the fact that they play a great role in the sensory reception. Think of the skin. Often epithelial tissues regenerate at a higher rate too. Let's classify epithelial tissues next. And epithelial tissues can be classified in two main ways. First, based on the shape of the cells. And this is especially for the outermost layers cell shape. So we can have cells that are squamous. These are spindle-shaped in a cross-section or look like a little flattened discs, if you wish. We can also have cuboidal cell shape. These really look, as the name suggests, like somewhat cubes in a cross-section. And then we have columnar cells. These in turn look like columns or pillars, if you wish. So, those are our three shapes that we can use to classify epithelial cells as. But there is also another classification method. We can look at the number of cell layers in each epithelial tissue. So we can have simple, which simply means that it is only one layer. And in this case, we would call the first example that we saw as simple squamous epithelium, while the second one would be simple cuboidal, and the third simple columnar. But what if there are multiple layers of cells in the epithelial tissues? Well, the word we use to describe many layers is stratified. And now we would end up with stratified squamous, stratified cuboidal, and stratified columnar epithelial tissue types. I hope that this makes sense. I think that it is a rather nice looking table that we have generated here. But, as always, there is a twist to the story. Some tissues may look like they would be multiple layers, but they really are only one layer. Let's look at this case. So these are known as pseudostratified. They appear as if they were many layers, but are really just one layer. And in this example, we are looking at as the columnar cells. Well, the way to remember this is to recall what the word pseudo means. Have you heard about pseudosciences? Yes, this group includes things such as astrology, alchemy, hollow earth theories, feng shui, aromatherapy, biorhythms, ear candling, energy healing, ghost hunting, levitation, numerology, essential oils, and so on. These are all beliefs or practices that are claimed to be scientific, but are incompatible with the scientific method, And therefore, for the time being, we are not recognizing them as real sciences. I hope that this helps you to remember the term pseudostratified. You should know a little more about these epithelial cells types, like where they are commonly found, what their physiology involves, but this all has been covered in your earlier courses. Now, I want to quickly mention glandular epithelia as well. Remember, glands were made of one or more cells that produce and secrete fluids known as secretions. And these can be classified in two ways. Firstly, based on the site where the products, these were secretions, are released. This gives us endocrine glands, where secretions are typically released to the bloodstream and act throughout the body. Like a good example would be hormones. And exocrine glands, where secretions are released locally and act on that site. A good example would be sweat glands as one. The second way to classify these are by the relative number of cells that form the gland. We can talk about unicellular or multicellular ones. So that's all I was planning to say about the epithelial tissues. Let's have a look at the next one. And we are going to talk about connective tissues next. These are the most numerous and widely distributed tissue type of the four. And it really is quite a varied group, as you will see. But at large, their functions include connecting things. These can be binding, supporting, protecting, insulating, acting as a storage, for example, for the energy in fat tissue, as well as transporting materials. Sometimes connective tissues are further divided in four main classes, as the real connective tissue, and this would include areolar, adipose fat, and reticular connective tissues, as examples of loose types, while regular, irregular, and elastic are examples of dense connective tissue. Cartilages contain three main types: hyaline, elastic, and fiber cartilage. We will review these in more detail in a later chapter relating to the skeletal system. Bone, of course, can be dense or spongy, and then again we will look at this in a greater detail later on. And finally, this often surprises students, blood is considered as a connective tissue too. And again, we will look at the blood and its structure and so on in much greater detail later on in your A and B studies. And finally, as I said earlier, the group of connective tissues is a very varied one. But all these include the following three components: ground substance, which is the kind of stuff in between everything else in this material; fibers, and the amount of this may vary from a lot in tendons and ligaments to none in blood; and cells. Again, what these are can be very varied. So although the composition and arrangement may vary, these three elements are usually found in varying quantities in the connective tissues. Okay, let's move on to talk about muscle tissues. And we remember that the main function of muscles was to contract, and through this way to generate movement. And this happens as the actin and myosin filaments move past each other, either contracting or relaxing the muscle on its legs. But we will look at this process too in much more detail in a chapter where we'll discuss this sliding filaments model. But because this requires a lot of energy, these tissues are typically highly vascular. And we remember, of course, that there were three types of muscle tissue. Skeletal muscles being the ones that attach to and result in the movement of the bones. These are under voluntary control and on a cellular level appear striated or banded if you wish. have a multiple nuclei, usually on the sides of the cell, and in general have this long cylinder shape. Cardiac muscles, instead, are found only in the walls of the heart. They are involuntary, so the cardiac contraction happens automatically. In terms of their appearance, these cells look branched, have striations like before, but this time have only one nucleus, which is typically central. And an important structure here was, as I'm sure that you remember, the intercalated discs. These were special adaptations that joined the cells and allowed passage of materials and signals, ensuring a coordinated uniform contraction of these cells. And finally, smooth muscle. This muscle type is found mainly in the walls of hollow organs and around blood vessels. Again, these are involuntary, so you do not think of the passage of the food through your digestive system. In terms of the microscopic appearance, there are no visible striations, and the overall shape is kind of a spindle-shaped. And there is usually one central nucleus. We will finish off with nervous tissue. And of course, these are the main components of the nervous system, so the brain, spinal cord, and nerves. And the function was to pass and process messages in order to regulate body functions. Nervous tissues are made of two specialized cells, neurons, which receive, generate, and conduct nerve impulses, and neuroglia, which are the supporting cells. And you will learn a lot more about these tissues later in this course, when we will review the general structure of a nerve cell, as well as talk in depth about the glial cell types. And this concludes our review of the tissues. Well done. I know that it has been a lot to do in 3 chapters in 1 week. As we move forward on this course, we will typically only do 1 chapter per week, so do not worry. But as I have said a number of times now, I believe that most of this should have been revision anyway. Please finish the assignments for this week, and I will see you in the next module.